Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Let's take a trip today back in time, but not as far as we usually go. The date, September the 11th, 1968. This is the year of the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam. The Beatles' White Album will be released in 2 months. And in Canada, the year began with Trudeau-mania. We roll up to the St. John Regional Airport in a shiny new red Pontiac Tempest. Lots of engine and lots of chrome. Parking is free and finding a space is no problem at this small airport on the outskirts of the city. A few more cars pull in after us, driven by mostly middle-aged men, executive types, dressed for business and style. We notice one man wearing a sharp gray suit, thin tie, brogues, a fedora, and a raincoat. He carries with him a suitcase in one hand and a briefcase in the other. Off to Bay Street, no doubt, for some important meeting. It is a half an hour before Air Canada Flight 303 to Toronto is scheduled to take off. Would you like to hop on board? Think we don't have enough time to get through everything at the airport and board that plane? Trust me, won't be a problem. This is the 1960s. There is no security check, no baggage screening, and no need to show any identification, which doesn't really matter anyway, as there is no photo ID. A ticket is all that's required, and it doesn't even need to be under your real name. This is the golden age of air travel, and it is all about convenience and comfort. We go to the check-in counter, though I suppose we could have easily just walked around the terminal, as there isn't even a fence separating us from the aircraft. Do you have your ticket? Of course you do. Your efficient secretary not only purchased one from a travel agent, but also placed it in your breast pocket so you wouldn't forget it. We did, however, forget one important thing that no one around us seems to be without: cigarettes. No problem, though. We can grab a pack from the vending machine in the lobby. Now let's sit back and relax in the airport lounge with a menthol cigarette and a rye and ginger. Over the airport BA system, we hear Frank Sinatra's "Come Fly With Me," which is then interrupted by an announcement. Flight 303 to Toronto is now ready for boarding. Time to go. Let's join the other passengers on the tarmac and prepare to climb the stairs leading to the Air Canada turboprop, the Vickers Viscount. Although a few years old, it is a beautiful plane. It is remarkably quiet and stable, making it a favorite for passengers on domestic flights. The large oval windows will offer plenty of opportunities for us to view the Canadian landscape below. We are greeted at the head of the stairs by a very pleasant and well-groomed flight attendant who directs us to our seats. There are plenty of newspapers and magazines on hand, and the emphasis is on comfort. Deep cushioned seats, air conditioning, and pressurized cabins. Take your seat, light up another cigarette, and grab a copy of the Financial Times. And if you're hungry, no worries. There will be a full meal on the flight served on china dishware, including Cherry's Jubilee for dessert. But for now, let's order a whiskey highball cocktail to steady our nerves. I have a feeling we're going to need it. Another passenger now climbs aboard. He is a tall man wearing a dark raincoat, nothing unusual. But what he carries concealed under that coat is another matter. For the first time in the history of commercial aviation in Canada, we're about to be skyjacked. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. My name is Mark, and over there sipping a pre-flight cocktail is Greg, and that means St. John. Nothing happened here, with the exception of the first skyjacking in Canadian history. Greg, Where did you find this gem? Every time I think I know all the major stories in St. John, one comes out of the woodwork, which is remarkable for a place where nothing ever happened. But where did you find this?
I had a vague memory of seeing a newspaper clipping on it, and I came across the story again this summer when I was doing some work either for the podcast or on another project, and I saw newspaper stories from 1968.
You would have been a young lad at the time. Do you have any personal recollection of this event?
No, I think I had a paper route at 1968, but I would read the sports pages and the comics. That's about it. And
skip over the skyjacking.
I didn't really, but I certainly knew about skyjacking as a phenomenon.
So we're going to be talking about the skyjacking incident, Charles Laverne Beasley, and the skyjacking of Air Canada Flight 303 out of St. John heading to Toronto. But we need to know the background to understand what was happening in 1968 that made this such an interesting event from a historic perspective. And we got a lot to unpack here. Yeah. And I'm not doing a travel pun here, but we have to understand the golden age of flight, followed by the golden age of skyjacking, and understand very briefly what was happening in the 60s in the background of all of this. So, Greg, we're in the 1950s, 1960s. I want you to take me on a flight.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the golden age of flight. I mean, we can talk commercial aviation. It's a bit of a nostalgic look, but it was kind of seen as a luxury, kind of relaxed at the time, and not for everyone. Only a small percentage of the population was flying in the 50s and 60s, but there was virtually no security. I'm not even sure there were boarding passes. There was no screening of passengers or baggage. There were no fences around airports. There were no armed police officers and things like that. So you could buy a ticket under someone else's name, and it was very relaxed. So again, it's a bit of nostalgia here, but it's a time when people dressed up to take airline flights, and to be fair, a lot of the passengers were business people, usually men, right?
Mm-hmm. And so it would have been an emphasis on comfort and convenience and no hassle. So
that's right.
And security would have been seen as a hassle. Yeah. Screening would have been considered as a hassle. But these flights were luxurious to begin with.
Relatively, yeah. And they were expensive relative to what came later. And of course, it's a bit ahistorical for us to even talk about no security because people didn't think about that. It was kind of a naive time, particularly in Canada where we had lower crime rates and it was pretty rare to encounter a handgun and anything like that. So, based on what came later, we look back and say, how could they travel that way? How could they run airlines and airports that way? But at the time, it was considered normal. They weren't worried about it. And they were kind of caught with their pants down when things started to happen.
And with the cost of it, I found a comparison with a United States flight. I forget where to, but they compared the flight costs back in the 1950s compared to today. And it was 10 times. So a flight that would cost $400 today cost $4,000 back then. And that is not factoring in inflation. That is dollar to dollar.
Yeah. And I think too, and I think economy flights and things like that only came later. Air Canada was a major carrier in Canada, and there was, I think, Canadian Pacific. But they tried to, they portrayed flying as sort of glamorous. There were free drinks on some flights, although Canada being Canada, there were sometimes limits on the number of drinks you could be served in an hour. And the other thing I didn't know, Mark, is until quite recently, if you flew over a province that didn't want you drinking in their airspace, like New Brunswick in 1968, they couldn't serve people when they were flying over New Brunswick. It seems like an old-fashioned rule, right? But
I found that an interesting fact because there's no such thing as provincial airspace, so it must have been on the honor of Air Canada to say, okay, fine, New Brunswick, you don't want us to be serving alcohol, we'll stop service. Yeah,
but there's the lawyer in you coming out, Mark, right?
There we go.
Yeah. So it's, an emphasis on attentive, especially trained stewardess who are usually young single women, an emphasis on grooming, poise, and professionalism. Do not panic. And actually, the training of both the pilots and the stewardesses was really important in the reaction to our hijacking and some of those early hijackings we might talk about.
Mm-hmm. So that's the upside of the golden age of flight. But there was a downside to it. Looking back, and I'm glad you mentioned about the flight attendants. I wouldn't say they would have been treated well in today's standards, especially the requirements. You had to be single, at least start off single. Yeah. You had to be a certain size and maintain that size, and those type of restrictions. And you were done at the age of 35.
Yeah, I think that changed a bit throughout the 60s, but you're right. I know some Air Canada stewardesses did get married once they were on the job, but single women were the way, how they started. And there was a lot of turnover as well. We don't know as much about the history of flight attendants in Canada as we do in the United States, where there's been a number of really interesting books. But in a way, it was a chance for young women to have a kind of a glamorous career. They could travel and see the world. So that was part of the attraction. Of course, the other thing, Mark, is that this was, to paraphrase a well-known academic book, cigarette nation, right? So there was also smoking on board. And of course, a lot more people smoked back then, maybe more than half of adult males and many adult women. But, with the smoking on board, everyone got to inhale.
It again comes back to that comfort and luxury. It's not only that it was allowed, it was encouraged.
Yeah.
The flight attendants might come around, would you like a cigarette? Yes. And I can just imagine the cabin by the end of the flight. It would be like being inside a cigarette. So just a little bit of a recap on the golden age of flight. We had no security.
Oh.
We had a focus on comfort and relaxation, so very relaxed environment, and then the decadence of the flight experience. And then that brings us into the golden age of skyjacking. Yeah. Because these things were easy targets. Take us into skyjacking. Let's do some skyjacking.
Well, ironically, you couldn't have the golden age of skyjacking without the golden age of commercial aviation, right? So it's kind of a trend, but basically a definition of skyjacking or hijacking is a hijacking of a passenger aircraft with a threat of force. It could be, I have a gun, I have a bomb, whatever, and forcing it to change its flight plan to go to another city or sometimes another country. Right. And sometimes there were ransom demands. So there were all different details of how these skyjackings unfolded. And it came to be noticeable. It came to be noticeable in particularly the American media by the mid 60s. Right. And so by the time our skyjacking took place out of St. John in 1968, many Canadians would have known about skyjacking because they would have heard about it in the news. But I think it came as a shock that poor, good old Canada would fall victim to the same phenomena.
Yes, and Mr. Beasley would have been an early adopter. He was at the beginning of the golden age of skyjacking.
Yes. Yeah, and it starts like 67 to 72. Obviously, there's hijackings before 67 and after, but during that peak period worldwide, there are about 300 hijackings or skyjackings and more than 130 in the USA alone. And of course, there's public perception is that they all went to Cuba. Most of them were not successful, but some of them that were successful did end up going to Cuba. And that factors into our stories as well. Sometimes it's political protest, is involved as a motive. Sometimes it's a ransom thing. I want money. Sometimes in the case of Mr. Beasley, he's fleeing the law, right? There's a warrant out for someone's arrest and they think, well, I'm going to go to another country to get away. And of course, Cuba did not have an extradition treaty with either the United States or Canada, right?
Points for Cuba. And What was the other attraction for Cuba?
Well, Cuba was a beacon for people who were like the political left, anti-racism, anti-Vietnam War, Black Power, student movement, people who are critical of U.S. imperialism within the U.S., a lot of idealistic young people. Cuba was a beacon of international socialist freedom, right, as they saw it, right? And Fidel Castro, that he's thumbing his nose at the United States.
Because
right?
they went through the Cuban Revolution and they defeated American imperialism in Cuba. So it was seen as you had Fidel Castro, of course, but then you had Che Guevara being these images of revolutionary and this worldwide movement that people were wanting. It was an anti-authoritarian time in the 60s. We'll get a bit more into the 60s, but that would make Cuba really attractive, that revolutionary flavor coupled with no extradition.
That's right. And some of the other motives, Mark, are like sometimes people just wanted a free trip. Sometimes there's a copycat thing. And also there's maybe psychological issues at play. And certainly there are a number of magazine articles and even one or two books at the time that delved into the mind of the hijacker. And I know at least one Canadian hijacker, again, unsuccessful, but very high profile, who couldn't really explain in the end why he did it. Right. So, again, it's a
the
fascinating
plane was
phenomenon.
There.
Yeah.
It seemed like a good idea at the time. I had some of those pre-flight drinks and I was feeling good, and I hijacked the plane.
Well, people want, like, it was a personal challenge. They wanted to be in the media. It was the thrill.
Let's go back to Cuba.
Yeah.
Now, Fidel Castro was not very pleased to have all of these commercial planes come into Cuba.
Yeah.
So I think originally there was kind of a stick it to the U.S., look at everyone coming to Cuba. But then after the 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th plane being rerouted to Cuba and that he has to get them back and the passengers back to U.S., it became a nuisance. And how did the hijacking or skyjacking end for a lot of people in Cuba?
The hijackers themselves were seen as a disruptive force by the Cuban government. And sometimes they were put in prison. Sometimes they were made to work on farms, for 5 years. And some of them were treated a little bit better than others as kind of political refugees. But basically, it became a pain in the butt for the Castro regime. Remember, Castro's regime was an authoritarian police state. So here you have these anti-authoritarian, free-wheeling sort of people coming in.
A dose of reality.
In the end, the Americans negotiated an agreement with Cuba. And again, these were countries that didn't recognize each other diplomatically. And Canada, I think, also jumped onto that. So once that agreement was in place, I think the Cubans were sending people back. I think about 90 planes ended up landing in Havana during the Golden Age, but at some point that stopped.
Now, the airline response, skyjacking during the Golden Age of skyjacking was described as an epidemic. It started getting legs underneath it, and nothing was going to stop it. And part of it was the airline response. Mm-hmm. So the airline response was to do what, Greg? I'm the pilot of the airplane. Yeah. You come in with a gun. What would I do? Would I fight you? Would I call in the Air Force to come and ground the plane? What would I do?
They were trained to not provoke, to cooperate. Do not put the passengers in danger. Do not put the planes in danger and the crews, right? So they were taught to cooperate to the best of their ability. The airlines resisted for two reasons, any sort of enhanced security. One was financial. Who's going to pay? They didn't want to be saddled with the cost of metal detectors and extra personnel screening, baggage and things like that. Secondly, they feared that any new security measures would create a hassle for passengers, and they were selling convenience and comfort.
The airlines did the math, and they go, hey, you know what? We might have 30 skyjackings a year, and we'll have to get the planes back from Cuba. But the cost of retrieving our planes is way less than the cost of putting all this security enhancement in and potentially the damage to our business. So it's going to be the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And that made it very attractive for skyjackers, but it started changing. One of the major changes happened with Eastern Airlines Flight 1320 going into Boston, was it?
Yeah, I think it was a shuttle flight, like New Jersey to Boston, not a long flight.
And that's where you had a skyjacker with a different motive. And what was the motive?
He was suicidal. Basically, he told the pilot, just keep flying as far to the east and let me know when we're running out of fuel.
Yes. So he wanted to kill himself and everyone on board. That's a different makeup of a skyjacker. And he ended up shooting the co-pilot dead and shooting the pilot. And the pilot was somehow shot through both arms, somehow was able to get the upper hand on the skyjacker and subdue him. But that was the first fatality in the U.S. related to skyjacking. So it took on a different flavor, but still, it wasn't enough to get those enhanced security measures in. What seemed to do it was this, Greg. Southern Airlines Flight 49, November the 10th, 1972. These guys, they skyjacked, but they threatened to crash into a nuclear facility. That changed the game. That made the American government have to say, you know what, we got to stop this. And that's brought in January the 5th, 1973, laws coming into place that physical screening had to be done and security had to be done prior to the flights. And that ended the golden age of skyjacking in the U.S.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, there was still a ripple effect.
Skyjacks happen.
Yeah, and of course, the first incident you talked about was 1970, Mark, and the second was 72. During that time, it was so high profile. Recently, we did have a chat about the movie that came out at that time, right?
Oh, Skyjack.
Yeah, Hollywood is picking up on what's going on in the real world, right? And
Charlton Heston. Yeah, and I just watched it. It holds up.
Yes. Yeah.
Good flick. But 1972, that was interesting. So that was in the height of skyjacking. And you think that glamorizing it through a movie wouldn't be a good thing to do.
Yeah. James Brolin played a Vietnam vet who was, kind of, I don't know if he was damaged because of the Vietnam War. He demanded to be flown to Russia. And Charlton Heston is the stalwart pilot, right? Yeah.
And we won't do any spoilers, but it worked out perfectly in Russia for him. It really did. Everything you dreamt of.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the golden age of skyjacking that Charles Beasley skyjacked within. Let's go to the 60s and tell me what is going on in the United States and worldwide.
Yeah. I mean, we're focusing more in the United States. Obviously, these issues also affected Canada, but our hijacker Beasley came from a certain context and background in the United States, right? That's what brought him to Canada. So we had the civil rights movement, late 50s, early 60s, black and white people, nonviolent civil disobedience, sit-ins at lunch counters and things like that, pushing for the end of legal segregation and discrimination in southern states, voter rights, getting people on the voters list. Of course, that led to action on the state level, and under President Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1965. So we can't say that the civil rights battle was over by that time, but certainly a lot of progress had been made by virtue of those two pieces of legislation.
Yes, to end legal discrimination and segregation, disenfranchisement.
Yeah.
But then you had de facto discrimination continuing after these laws went through. And that led to, within the Black community, high unemployment, extreme poverty, lack of opportunities in education and higher education, and police brutality was a big issue. Yeah. So that non-violent civil disobedience was looked at and going, we need a more immediate solution to this. And that brought in more Black liberation movements, such as the Black Panther Party and the Student National Coordinating Committee.
Yeah,
SNCC.
Yeah, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came out of the civil rights movement, but it morphed into an all-Black organization by 66 or 67, also made cause with the anti-war movement, because a lot of the Black Power advocates were saying that Black people are more likely to be drafted and things like that. And so, of course, you had the leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and others. And so it was part of that anti-authoritarian movement of the 1960s with a goal for racial justice. And there were different strategies put forward. One was more militancy, one was Black separatism, Black power, let's celebrate Black culture, right? And so it's a very vibrant time. And of course, the Black Panther Party, organized in California at first, came out of this social ferment as well.
So you have things heating up. Malcolm X is assassinated, what was in 1965, and 1968, Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968. That changed things a lot for the movement, and it brought certain people within the movement, because Charles Beasley did claim that it was the Martin Luther King assassination that pushed him over the top. And that's in his own words.
Yeah. So but he was also involved in local struggles in Texas, right? Where things were becoming a bit more militant as well. And of course, through some of those local struggles, those activists faced the power of the law, the police and the state and federal governments, right? And they were very frustrated.
And then the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And that became increasingly unpopular as time went on, and you had the draft come in.
Yeah.
So that's what was boiling around in the 1960s around Charles Laverne Beasley, our skyjacker of Air Canada 303.
Yeah.
Let's get into Charles Laverne Beasley. And a lot of what we know about him is self-reported. He did a few interviews with newspapers around the 90s and early 2000s. And we learned this. He was born in 1946 in Texas, possibly 1948. I think there's some disagreement with his birth date. But either way, he was the son of a sharecropper, ninth of 10 children. According to him, he did not stay in Texas. He moved to San Francisco as a teen, which would have been very close to that heart of the student protest movement.
Possibly, yeah. Berkeley, a lot happening in like the free speech movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement in San Francisco, clustering around Berkeley University.
So that could have influenced his mindset.
Yeah.
And then he was inspired by early activism like the Black Panthers Party and the SNCC.
Yeah.
He returned to Texas and joined a local chapter of SNCC and led some peaceful demonstrations.
Oh, he was certainly involved. He was certainly involved in them, and there were a number of things going on in Dallas. That's where he was based. One of the things in Dallas was the SNCC was trying anti-poverty organizing and community organizing, and Black cultural centers and things like that. And they had a dispute over a white-owned supermarket. They believe that there should be Black businesses in Black communities, so they were involved in those demonstrations. And I think he became more radicalized because of that experience.
And then, as we said, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968, that, according to Mr. Beasley, convinced him that nonviolence was not effective for true political change.
Yeah.
Then you have the Vietnam War, and he started getting involved in that aspect, and he reports that he helped deserters from the U.S. military base in Texas cross from Detroit into Canada to get asylum, which I think might lead to some credence of his later story.
I think we should point out, Mark, that the interviews were 30 or 40 years after the events we're talking about. Some people have a tendency to embellish or to, again, we don't know. At the time in 1968, anything that was in the media about Beasley was coming through third parties. He did not do any interviews with media in 1968, but it's what people said about him, right?
Yeah. Yes. So political activist, criminal, mix of the two. We don't know. But
we should say that the FBI, our good friend J. Edgar Hoover, through its infamous COINTELPRO domestic espionage program, which wasn't revealed to the U.S. public until the early 70s, was spying on SNCC and other Black power groups in Texas and elsewhere. And his name appears in one of their reports, probably provided by an informer within the Black activist community.
which seems to create some credence for his story. Now, two ways you can look at it, though, is we're hearing this 30 years after the fact, because like what he's saying lines up perfectly with what was going on at the time, but maybe too perfectly.
Yeah.
After 30 years of hindsight, you could make your story line up. So we don't know, but there's an incident in Texas that will eventually get us to St. John.
Yes, and these weird connections in history. How do we go from a small town in Texas, which is, I think, the closest bigger community is Paris, Texas, and then it's about 60 or 70 miles from Dallas. It's
population.
Sorry,
population 800 people. Ladonia, Texas. And a bank robbery. Let me take us through this. So let's start off with motive, according to Beasley. And of course, this was coming 30 years later in that interview. He claimed the reason for robbing the bank was to obtain bail money for the people in his network who were jailed for assisting U.S. Army deserters. So this may have been politically motivated, this robbery. We don't know. The other thing we don't know is why they chose Ladonia. Was this a well thought out plan? Did they scope out the place beforehand? Or was it just opportunity? Maybe it was ease of escape. We don't know. A lot of things we don't know, but this is what we do know. And this reads like a Hollywood movie. It is a hot summer day in Texas, and it is high noon. Small town bank, the Farmers and Merchant State Bank. There are two employees inside. There's an older man who was about 62, believed to be the bank manager, and then a woman who was on duty, likely a teller. The other staff had gone for lunch, and maybe they knew that. Maybe that's why they picked noon to go in, because there were less bank employees inside. Now, outside, 3, possibly 4 men pull up outside the bank in a 1964 blue Plymouth. 2 men exit the Plymouth and storm into the bank. One was about 6 feet tall, wearing mirrored sunglasses, which fits the description of Charles Beasley. And the other one was wearing a ski mask. Both had pistols. And they did the classic line, "This is a bank robbery." For some reason, and we don't know why, they put the older man, the bank manager, on the ground. One of the men pistol whips the bank manager. Don't know why, but injures him. Then they force the teller to load the bag up with cash. And the exact amount? $13,111.67. Now, that's quite precise. But I guess if you're grabbing cash at the time, you might put in some coin. And that's US dollars. And then the 2 assailants exit the bank and jump into the getaway car and speed away. Dumped the car, burned it, and transferred into, what was it again? A red Mercury convertible.
It was a sporty Mercury, and it was owned by and driven by one of the executive members of the Dallas chapter of SNCC, who had been in the news for different activities in the community. And so the money was never recovered.
But Greg, I want to be keeping low profile after a bank robbery.
Yeah.
A red Mercury convertible?
Yeah. Yes. Well,
loaded with bank robbers when likely being pursued doesn't seem to be low profile.
Yeah.
We don't know what happened to that car.
No, and about that, well, I mean, if it was owned by Bell, because Bell was the other person who was eventually arrested, so they assumed there were 4 men. There might have been 2 drivers, but they don't know. But in the end, Bell was arrested fairly early on, and then a witness identified Beasley from a photo lineup, which is not a lineup of people, but a book of photos. And what's interesting, Mark, is that the FBI, I thought it's a bank robbery in a small town in Texas. The FBI were on the case earlier, as well as the Texas Rangers, and eventually the Dallas police.
Beasley is on the lam now.
Yeah.
He's into the wind at this point. Now, he makes his way to Canada. Now, we know he made it to Canada. He claims that he went to Montreal. Let's talk about it. How would Mr. Beasley make it from Ladonia, Texas to Montreal being pursued by law enforcement?
Well,
I got a couple of theories.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you mentioned Windsor earlier, and he did at some point after his arrest tell the authorities that he had been in Canada for about 3 weeks, and he came through Detroit into Windsor. And then he said he went to Montreal. There's no proof that he was in Montreal. But what's really interesting for a Black activist to be anywhere in Canada in late 1968, late August and September 1968, Montreal is a place to be because there were a lot of really interesting things happening. And of course, in the Black community, and later there's going to be the protest at Sir George Williams University, but that's going to happen a few months later, right? So it's very likely he did go to Montreal because he ends up in the Maritimes. So you can't get from Windsor to the Maritimes without going through Quebec, right?
And he had a little bit of time.
Yeah.
The bank robbery itself happened on August the 19th. A warrant for his arrest did not come out until August 28th.
Yeah.
So that would have bought him 9 days of not having a warrant everywhere he went. And this, I think, adds some credence to his story that he helped deserters make their way to Canada.
Yeah.
If he did that, he would know how to covertly make it to Canada from Texas. And that background, because that's a long drive. If he drove, and I looked it up today, and the roads would have been way better today than they were back in 1968. That's a 25-hour straight drive to get to Montreal. It would be a long drive going through states like Arkansas in an era of racial profiling.
Yes.
It would not have been easy, but the other theory is he hopped a plane. I'm assuming he would not hop a plane in Dallas. You would want to be getting out of that state very quickly, but he may have hopped the plane.
Well,
but
he claimed he came through Detroit and Windsor. He might have flown to Michigan. And again, he got into Canada. He didn't need a passport. I mean, there were border controls, but there were people coming. The border was pretty porous in the late 60s between the two countries. That's why so many American draft dodgers got in, right? But yeah, you would think a Black man would face more challenges in terms of travel as well as getting into. But he didn't mention any. Not that he was asked. He didn't mention any hassles getting into Canada. He seemed to, in a strange way, he seemed to kind of like Canada in retrospect. When he was interviewed years later. Yeah,
he seemed to have a connection, and that's why that lending credence to his story. Yeah. He'd been to Canada before. He's done this crossing. It just seemed too perfect that he knew how to do this so well, so covertly, and he could have easily gone to Mexico. That would have been a closer place to go.
Yeah.
And it's seemingly more attractive, maybe, than trying to make it up north.
And he might have had a connection with that. You're right, the anti-war movement. But you don't have to, deserters had more problems, but you didn't have to kind of smuggle people into Canada back then. And he might have also just heard about Canada being a haven for draft dodgers and being a different type of society. They're not involved in the Vietnam War, right? And this type of thing, right? So,
but he didn't want to stay. Because he eventually hijacked a plane to take him to Cuba. But so he's in Montreal. Maybe he's in. He claims he's in Montreal. Went through Detroit, Windsor, got to Montreal, and stayed there for a while. Then ended up in Halifax, Nova Scotia,
which seems like a very, other than it's pointing towards Cuba, right? But so from what we know, based on what came out at police evidence, he was in Halifax for a certain period. Again, there was a bit of a Black Power movement and civil rights movement in Halifax. We don't know the connections there. Someone bought a ticket in his name.
Not his name. Under what name?
Yeah.
Garvey?
And then at the Halifax International Airport, at 1:00 in the morning, right? And then drove him to the Saint John Airport. So he had a handgun on him when he arrived. And so, but he bought the ticket the ticket was Saint John to Windsor with a stop off at Toronto, right? Because that was the original planned destination of that flight.
Okay, you just said St. John Airport. Tell me about St. John Airport, 1968.
Yeah, well, it's a lot smaller, of course, but the St. John Municipal Airport. And by the way, St. John Airport is still kind of small, Mark. When you hear, please go to gate 1. I think
it's one of 2.
Yeah, one is. Yeah. So anyway, but it used to be closer to town until 1952. It was actually the municipal airport, which was owned by the city, was in the northern section of the city known as Milledgeville, and which is quite close to where the regional hospital is now and the university. And it was a small airport, very busy during World War II. And its most famous visitor prior to it closing down was who?
Amelia Earhart. Fun fact, in 1932, so 5 years before she went missing.
Yeah, so she was a well-known, most famous female aviator in the world. So after the war, the city realized planes were becoming bigger. They hoped that after the war there'd be this kind of new age of commercial and freight, aviation. So land was looked at and purchased at so-called Clover Valley area, which is out east of St. John, what used to be called Simon's Parish, which eventually was amalgamated as part of St. John. And that opened up in 1952. It was owned by the city and county, and it got a new terminal in 1960. And over the years, enhancements were made. But Mark, the St. John Airport had a number of problems, but what was the biggest problem?
I'm going to say this. The St. John perennial problem of fog.
Yes.
Unless you're fighting cholera back in the 1800s, then supposedly it was good. But for air travel, we can say quite conclusively it was not good.
Yeah, and I can attest to the fact that even with modern navigation equipment and better planes and things like that, I've been diverted more than once to Moncton. There are also some other issues with the topography and some of the other issues. And one of the things that emerged, as the airport was kind of expanding, they did put in a new 7,000-foot runway in 1967 because they were looking ahead to the age of the jet, right? The DC-9s, the 747s, the Lockheed Airbuses, things like that. But one of the issues was there was also an airport in Fredericton and one in Moncton. And they were all sort of competing, and they're only about an hour away from one another. In 1968, the municipal airport was finally sold to the federal government. And at the time, it was hoped that would help improve the airport. And again, it's part of that booster thinking of the late 60s at St. John. We're going to grow and grow and grow, and we need like a bigger airport, right? So that was the airport that the incident in 1968 where our incident starts. Okay,
now describe the airport. The current terminal building is that the original one that would have been there in 1968?
No, I haven't looked at a lot of detail. Now, Harold Wright has a lot of information on that, but I've seen one photo, and the front of it was open. It was like a big open concept, like you could look out, clear windows right out to the parking lot.
Oh, we're bringing in Mr. Beasley.
Yeah.
September the 11th, 1968. September the 11th.
I know.
What are the odds of that? Well, I know the mathematical odds, 1 in 365. But come on, that is quite the coincidence.
Yeah.
And he's coming in. He was driven, as you said, from Halifax. This is a morning flight?
I think it left at around 9:30 or 10.
9:30 or 10.
Yeah.
Okay. He arrives. He's driven there. The eyewitnesses say it was a car from away, either Quebec license plates or Ontario license plates.
Yeah.
Would that have been a rental?
I don't know. I don't know. But one of the things, Mark, is that, it's credible because Mr. Charles Bud Kavanaugh, who was a ticket agent who was interviewed at the time, you could look out from the ticket desk right out into the parking lot where people are being let off because it was that kind of open concept, the big glass windows, right? The flight had actually originated from Moncton, which is just an hour away, even shorter by air. And it was a beautiful plane, a little outdated, but it was a Viscount, a British-made plane, turboprop, quiet, stable for its age. But this time the Viscount was more servicing regional routes, right? And it was kind of an economy craft. And there were only, I think, 17 passengers on the plane. Some got on in Moncton and others joined them in St. John. And so the plane was less than half full. And one of those passengers was Mr. Beasley, traveling under another name.
Now, he picked a Viscount, which had a maximum range of about 1,400 miles.
Yeah.
That wouldn't get you to Cuba.
No, I think Cuba was 1,500, and of course, pilots probably want to have a little more gas in the tank, fuel in the tank, and so. And the other thing is that as people found out later, the Viscount, the flight 303, the gas tank was not full when it left Moncton, right? So often on these regional jobs, they might have like flown it to Toronto and topped it off there, right? So
not the best aircraft if you want to be going to Cuba. You would have to be refueling in the United States, which doesn't seem to be optimum for a person who's skyjacking to have to take that risk of landing in continental U.S.
I don't think he understood the details of the craft, and who knows?
I don't think he did.
No, and like, do we even know that the hijacking was planned? Right?
Ooh,
we don't. So
it might have been a crime of opportunity.
Yeah, but the fact that he was traveling with a pistol, we don't know, right?
And a handgun in Canada. Well, I suppose he could have brought it in from the States easily enough because there were no searches.
You could buy a handgun in Canada at that time on the black market. It would be possible. I've researched all sorts of crime stories where it's happening.
So we have the morning of September 11th.
Yep.
Charles Laverne Beasley, the bank robber from Ladonia, Texas, gets out of a car driven by someone we don't know and likely will never know who actually drove him to St. John.
He had a beard.
The driver had a beard, so there was some identification or some description of the person. Okay, so Charles Beasley gets out of that car. He's wearing a raincoat. He has concealed on him a .22 caliber pistol. He walks up to the gate. He gives his ticket to the ticket agent.
Charles Bud Kavanaugh, who I actually know.
And it says Mr. Garvey. It didn't even have a first name.
Yeah.
But that was not unusual.
No.
Then he gets on the flight. And we're about to have the first skyjacking in Canadian history. And that is the podcast. We're going to end it off here with quite the cliffhanger, but come back for part 2 because we have some surprises in store. Actually, I'm going to tell you the surprise. We have eyewitnesses, people who were actually on that flight. We'll be giving interviews in our part 2 of the first skyjacking in Canadian history. So come on back for part 2.
Thank you for listening to St. John Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.